Business Hour. I'm Elysabeth Alfano. Great to be back with you in studio. As they say, I've been running around the country like many of us, going to conference after summit after meeting in person. And as exciting as it is, and it is exciting, it feels good to be back in the studio. But I won't be here for long because next week I'll be back in New York City. The Future Food Tech Summit, one of my very favorite summits of the year. They're focusing on alternative proteins in New York next week. That would be June 21st and 22nd. I do hope people can meet me there. I'm taking gobs of meetings, and I can't wait to talk about alternative proteins, how we scale alternative proteins, fermented proteins, cultivated meat, and plant-based options, all of them. Very exciting. And my guest today, we're going to dive into this in detail to see just how challenging it will be to scale our sector despite rising demand. You'd think it'd be so easy, but it's just not going to be as easy as all that. So we'll dive into that in just a second. I just want to say, not only am I in New York City next week for Future Food Tech, but I am throwing a party at the New York Stock Exchange. So VegTech Invest finally heading over to New York to celebrate what we launched last December. So by the time this interview actually comes out on podcast, we will probably be drinking on the New York Stock Exchange floor. So I hope that you will see those pictures and celebrate with us. Even if you're not there in person, we'll probably go live from the New York Stock Exchange and have lots of pictures on LinkedIn. And of course, if you haven't connected with me on LinkedIn, that's just crazy. You should do that right now. Okay, but let's not delay. I want to talk about the real growth of this sector. No point in talking about the New York Stock Exchange if we can't grow our sector. And we're having some trouble. Let's be realistic. We have some bottlenecks. So I want to come on and bring my guest today, an expert in the industry, engineer David Ziskind. He runs Next Gen Ag at Black & Veatch. David, thanks for being with me today.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Great to be on and appreciate you having me.
Yes, I've been wanting to talk to you for a while. Back in the Clubhouse days, if people remember that, seems like a long time ago now, is only maybe 6, 8, 10 months ago. Back in the Clubhouse days, you and I would hop on together and talk about scaling issues. I can't think of any better or bigger expert in the field of scaling food than you, and your focus here on Next Gen Ag, so plant-based alternatives, fermented proteins, cultivated meat. I would like to just level set first. Tell everyone exactly what you do with Black & Veatch and really what Black & Veatch does, first of all.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks again, Elizabeth, and definitely looking forward to seeing you at Future Food Tech next week in New York City. And of course, congratulations. I'm very excited for you and VegTech Invest coming up on the New York Stock Exchange for the party next week. So my background in Black & Veatch. So I focus on helping food companies scale products, specifically scale manufacturing. So my technical background is actually as an electrical engineer in the automation and control space. Did a lot of work in the consumer packaged goods as well as food and beverage space. And then went on to manage design build projects in the food and beverage space, everywhere from startups to Fortune 500 companies. And of course, just building a facility is a challenge. But then when you add on, working with a new food product, there are all sorts of technology challenges associated with that. Generally, some unknowns, right? You don't know everything like an established food product. So my focus and the focus on the Next Gen Ag team at Black & Veatch. So to back up for a moment, Black & Veatch is a 100+ year global, 100-year-old plus global engineering firm. Got offices all over the world. Have executed projects all over the world, primarily in the infrastructure space. So thinking power, water, wastewater, telecom, oil and gas. And one of the areas where Black & Veatch decided to start focusing on several years ago was how do we take our expertise in those infrastructure areas and apply them to the scaling challenges with food. So as we think about a food product, especially these new products, there's all sorts of food tech in there, right? There's the research and development, there's the food science, all those details, a lot of the intellectual property that these companies are bringing to the table. And what seems a little more mundane, but a lot of people don't think about it, is the infrastructure behind it. So what do you need in terms of water, power, wastewater treatment, air and other gases, things like that. What do you need for the facility to really support that? And what's the right size of that? Because you want flexibility, right? But you don't want too much flexibility, because that costs you in terms of money and time. So that's really where we help companies help on that scaling, that infrastructure scaling piece, and how to do it in a sustainable manner.
So much to unpack there. First of all, I just want to talk about the transition, if you will, or the awakening, if you will, of Black and Veatch saying, hey, we do power plants, we do major infrastructure, but we see the potential in next gen ag, or getting into the alternative food sector. And I'm wondering what brought you there. Is it the growth potential of the sector, or is it the individual demand of the company? So let me explain what I mean. When I think of the growth of the sector, I think of already established food companies switching over some of their plants and infrastructure to create plant-based meats. I don't think of that big of a demand when you're talking globally at the scale that Black and Veatch works for the little tiny producers. But yet they're also starting to build their own factories. So what was it that drew you to the sector? Was it the smaller players or the big players?
So that's a great question, Elizabeth. I think a couple of things. Really, it's the excitement, seeing the excitement among the founders in the food tech space, but also seeing that there's a bit of a gap there. So we've got a lot of really smart food scientists and entrepreneurs who really know the food science side of things, certainly much better than I do, right? I can barely scrape the surface of that. But what I've seen fairly consistently is just that gap, that infrastructure gap. What do you do from an infrastructure standpoint? And I hear sometimes, well, I'm just going to go with a co-manufacturer. I'm going to go with a CDMO. And that's an approach. But as many companies know and are finding out, contract manufacturers only have so much capacity. And particularly when we start looking in the fermentation and precision fermentation space, there's a lot of competition there, and you're unlikely to be able to pick up the phone today and, have a spot next week, next month, or in some cases, even bordering on next year. So I was really excited. How do we address that, what I'll call infrastructure gap? So that's what drew me to the segment. I also see some excitement. We're really just seeing a change in the food system. So you've seen, mass-produced food really, I guess, took off, call it after World War II or so. You started really seeing, grocery stores, right? And you could buy practically everything. But we're in this, as I like to talk about it, the cusp of this fourth agricultural revolution. We've got these changes. We've got these differences in the food system. Certainly, they're not going to happen overnight, but to me, that's an opportunity to be a part of it. So that's what excites me.
So there's so much to unpack there. I want to get to how exciting it is to see this fourth industrial revolution, agricultural revolution take place, and how we can all be a part of it. But I'll take a step back and I'll say, when I think of the uptick or the benefits of working with a co-manufacturer, I think you don't have to reinvent the wheel, not to mention the cost of building a ground up, cost and time of building a ground up new plant. And then you have to have the expertise to run that plant. So you have to hire the folks to do that. That's its own black hole of lack of talent to run these plants, let alone lack of co-manufacturing plants themselves. So I think, oh my gosh, it's its own business model to run this kind of plant. And I'm always surprised when a startup says, I'm going to take this money that I've gotten through venture and I'm going to put it towards running a plant. It seems like so much work. And yet at the same time, there's not enough co-manufacturing capacity. So who is it who's the bigger client? The small guy who wants to start his own, or the existing big players who want to add capacity?
That's a really good question. So I think we see both. I think we see demands from both sides. And when I think about that choice of what, that classic buy versus build, do you do it in-house or do you get the contract manufacturer? Sometimes I get the question, well, which way should we go? And I always say it depends, because there are pros and cons to both approaches.
People hate you for this.
Because there is no right answer. There is no right answer for your model. I mean, gosh, you think about there's the costs themselves that you can fairly, I'll call it straightforward, um, calculate, right? But then you think about from a flexibility standpoint, when you start thinking about capacity constraints, when you start thinking, as you mentioned it, now you've got to hire your
Labor.
own manufacturing operations team. Then there are trade-offs like that intellectual property and trade secrets. We saw in the news, gosh, a year ago or so, there was a public dispute with one of the players and their co-manufacturer around some, potentially, uh, maybe misuse of trade secrets, right? So there's that to think about. You got to think about the scheduling piece. There's a lot of demand here, right? What
Mm.
happens when someone comes along who has more money or has a bigger swings the bigger club, right? What do you do there? So
Mhm.
a lot of things to consider.
A lot of things to consider. And I always wondered why this doesn't pop up. So we're talking about, is it the smaller player or the bigger player? But what about a neutral player who says, well, I'm not Nestle and I'm not, Beyond Meat or Perfect Day or what have you. I'm just a co-man. I'm just going to be in the business of building co-manufacturing plants. I have no IP. I'm just running the factory and you can all use me. Do you ever see that?
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges that co-manufacturers have is you've sort of got to be that jack of all trades.
Mm,
So it's one thing when you've got for lack of a better term, I'll call it a purpose-built co-man who's really only focused on one particular product, or maybe even has, is white labeling for one particular client, right? You sort of know the process. A lot of what we see in the startup space, though, is you've got these changing demands. So the startups want co-manufacture with a lot of flexibility in terms of not only capacity, but what they can produce, what they can do differently. So I think there are different models and different challenges there. And then to add on to it, you think from a startup standpoint, if they're raising all this money, I think your typical VC does not want to see a lot of their investment go into these hard assets, right? That are
right.
not you're not seeing the return that you expect. So you've got all these things in play. So suffice it to say, saying just going to go the contract manufacturing route. There's a lot of stuff in there to think about.
Yes. So, when you're so excited in your kitchen launching your own version of a plant-based bacon and you think like, I can't wait to take on the world with my new plant-based bacon, because I've had that thought many times in my kitchen actually. And truth be told, I make a very excellent plant-based bacon. Out of 3 ingredients in my kitchen. But I don't go further with that idea because I don't want to do this, which is struggle with co-manufacturing issues, etc. So I've gone the VegTech route instead to help the industry. But something that's interesting to me as you talk about these smaller players and these new demands and the shifting global food supply system. So as we're in this 4th industrial revolution, are you seeing, for lack of a better expression, I'll say Willy Wonka type demands? Like, okay, sure, co-manufacturing of my parents used to look like this, but we now want like this new plant that looks like this. So are you seeing these new startups that have new demands that are potentially creating food that's never been created before through precision fermentation and cultivated meat? What kind of new demands or requests are you seeing in the production of the creation of a plant?
Yeah, so great point. You do have these new ways of producing food, right?
Mm,
So when you think of, maybe I'll overgeneralize here, but when you think of traditional or plant-based proteins of the past, your traditional model was an extruded model, right?
right.
So, you have the right extruder, you have the right setup, you have the right mix. It's fairly straightforward, maybe the wrong way to put it, but you sort of have the general process there. We've really moved beyond. Certainly, there are still extruded products, but we've sort of moved beyond that, particularly where you're seeing the different types of fermentation. You're seeing precision
Mhm.
fermentation. You're really seeing these different processes. And to complicate it, a lot of what's being done right now is being done in the lab. So how do we get to this to make this product, right? Well,
Mhm.
now how do we scale it? So scaling, that process of scaling is not, it's not just multiply by X and do the same thing. A lot of the times we're looking at, is there a different, even part of the process or the way you execute the process, that makes it more cost effective, makes it easier, makes it faster, any of those items. So I agree. Part of the co-manufacturing challenge is what does that scale up really look like? And in the case of products that are still in the lab, what's different? Because you might invest in a piece of machinery or go one route and find out it doesn't work at scale. So what's next? What do you do next?
Wouldn't that just be a question of experience? So let me rephrase that. I'm surprised to hear that when one company goes to scale, they might not have all the answers for how to scale. Have I understood that correctly?
I, I think that's a fair statement. So I think when we're talking about scaling these technologies, so you do them at different volumes, right? In the case of fermentation, but there's no guarantee as you scale, you're having to make these little tweaks, these little changes. So you're making these jumps, and you've got to. I would say, I don't like using the word always, but I'd say there's always a bit of uncertainty in there. And it's a question of how big is that uncertainty? What does it look like? What's your scaling jump? What are you jumping from in terms of capacity? And you have to have that right capacity difference to make sure you're getting your scale up experiments. You're getting to the point that really makes sense.
So, if extrapolating from what you're saying, most startups then at some point, by the time they get to scale, and scaling doesn't go from 0 to 100, right? It's just like a car. So it goes from 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20. So this is also expensive because you're needing potentially different machinery, each scale up, and then a larger factory, larger capacity. So it's, potentially 2 steps up, 1 step back, because you think you've got it all right, but you don't have it all right. 1 step back, and then hopefully 3 steps up, and you go from there. But should every startup have an engineer on staff?
So coming from the engineering side of things, I would say yes.
Yes.
I think there's a balance, right? When you think of engineering in startups or even traditional food manufacturing, you need enough of a technical background and understanding from a facility and infrastructure standpoint, but you can also leverage external partners. So I think part of the decision-making process as you're looking to scale up a product is the infrastructure piece, is the facility piece. I see sometimes that people are so focused on the equipment. What does it take to actually make this product? They're not really thinking about, again, the infrastructure demands, the things that I'm going to call more mundane. How much water do I need? What sort of wastewater am I producing? What are the power needs? What are the air needs? Things like that. And then how do you do it from a sustainable aspect? So another area, again, this could be a whole nother separate discussion, but the sustainability piece is really neat to me. Seeing a lot more focus now with new food products, with new brands, focused on, I'll call it sustainability baked in, or sustainability by design, sustainability coming into the process early on, as opposed to I see a lot of the traditional food manufacturing that's established now. Sustainability is certainly a concern, but you've got an established process, so it's more of what I call a bolt-on, added on the back end, as opposed to we're seeing a lot of interest in these products in these companies as they're scaling. How do you do it in a sustainable manner? How do you have that, I'll call inherent sustainability?
And just to kind of go over probably what's obvious for folks, but still, it's one of those almost overused words. So when you're talking about sustainability, you're talking about recycling water that hasn't been tainted. I'm just giving random examples, or correctly processing wastewater, or give us examples of what would be baked in initially to reach sustainability goals.
Sure. So I think the recycle piece is certainly important there. I like looking at it though from a reduce standpoint. What's the first thing you can do is reduce, right? How do you use less water? How do you use less electricity? And again, as we start talking about these different products and things that are coming out, you're seeing interest in upcycled ingredients. You're seeing interest in taking a waste stream from another manufacturer, another process, and upcycling that and turning that into some value added ingredient or food product. That to me is where there's a really big impact. But certainly in the sustainability piece, you got to consider, right, what's your what's your water use? What's your electric use? What does your wastewater look like? And then are there ways to tweak the process where you can reduce, or if you can't reduce, is there a part of it where you can upcycle, or is there an offtake where someone else can take part of what you're generating and turn that into yet another upcycled product?
So added on business streams. Let me see if I've understood this. Are you seeing potentially non-competing but different companies come together to produce together, such that company A might put out product one, and that product could have a byproduct that could, for company B, be product two? I don't want to oversimplify, but are you seeing that sort of collaboration?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. And you really have this, you have this interesting partnership where you can have everyone win, where you're potentially taking what may have been a waste stream from one producer, from one company, and you've got someone else who is upcycling it, turning it into, whether it's something for human food, whether it's for animal food, whether it's a waste to energy type initiative. There are a lot of things in there that, to me, those are what really moves the needle from a new technology standpoint, but also sustainability standpoint of, you're not just reducing your utilities, but you're taking this inherent waste stream, for lack of a better word, and turning it into something that is no longer waste, and probably monetizing it along the way.
Yeah. And what one company defines as waste, we're not talking about human waste or animal waste, something like this. We're talking about byproduct, really, which is not waste at all, really. It's actually somebody else's gold, potentially. We do see products on the market for upcycled vegetables and, cauliflower, particularly in the food space, where so much food just rots in the grocery store itself. There's all this potential for upcycling, but I'm being oversimplistic. I mean, there's more byproducts that can be upcycled for creation of new things. And I'll say, from my perspective, not animal products. I always hate to see byproducts go back into the animal agriculture world that then just create more problems. Certainly not sustainably minded as you look at all the waste streams from that industry. So, I like to see these novel upcycled products go back into the system that is sustainably minded. But so we're talking about, all the things that can happen and the possibilities and the demands for the sector. We started the show saying, hey, there is so much demand for plant-based foods. I'll quote the Plant-Based Foods Association here and say that the plant-based foods in general in the U.S. were up 3 times as much as the regular food category in the U.S. for 2021. So you see that sort of 3 times growth happening for our sector. Why is it so hard? Why can't we just scale up? I don't want to, again, be oversimplistic here, but we're talking about how you can help, and how more and more startups are putting together their own manufacturing plants. So why do we still have all these bottleneck issues of not finding co-manufacturers or not being able to scale? What is it that we can't figure out?
That's a great question. And I think you have a number of things throughout this supply chain. So if you sort of work backwards, it's, even starting with consumer acceptance, shall we say. So, you're seeing some more acceptance certainly in the plant-based space, but you're starting to have some consumers question, anywhere from ingredients to the fact that it's processed. If we go a little bit outside plant-based and start talking about cultivated meat, we have some questions on consumer acceptance, right? So there's that consumer acceptance question. There's the getting into the grocery store, getting that shelf space with other competing products. We can also consider, just in general, I think the subsidies in our food system and what's being emphasized there, right? Just a broader topic to think about. But so we're carrying backwards. We've got this consumer acceptance. We got the price issue, right? I think if there's a new and novel product, people are willing to pay maybe a little bit more to try it once or twice. But if you're trying to feed more than one person, if you're trying to feed your family, at some point, paying a multiple of a competing product, just, I would say doesn't make sense for most people and is not, puts it outside the reach. So you've got all those, but then as you push back into you start looking back to the manufacturing side of things. You look at, again, if we're talking about a new technology, maybe the process isn't defined. Maybe there are not a lot of facilities or even equipment out there that makes it. So having to, build that production capacity, right? Build that ability to process it. You've also got the inherent technology scale up. So you're going from, again, we're not talking about making an established product that's been made for 20, 30, 40 years. We've got this new product that we're trying to create, and you've got to balance the facility needs, balance the process technology needs, and then balance everything on the back end from your cost of production to your getting shelf space, and then down the line to that consumer acceptance piece.
Mm-hmm. So much to unpack there. I'll start with the consumer acceptance, and I'll work back, and then I'll end at the beginning, which maybe is money. But I'll first start with consumer acceptance. From the studies that I'm seeing, particularly around cultivated meat, and this would be with younger folks, but also with older folks, they're sort of saying, hey, if I want to have my meat and eat it too. So I've seen studies, and I'll put this in the show notes because I'm not remembering the name of the study, but I found it in Veg Economist magazine. I'm going to say it's about 9 months old, where they say, I see 40% of my plate being cultivated meat, 40% being regular meat, and 20% being plant-based meat. And let's just move on. Like, that's particularly, you look at younger kids, 12 and under, they don't have these, existential questions for themselves. Should I, shouldn't I? They're just growing up on plant-based 3, 4, 5 times a week. There's nothing to even talk about. It's food. I eat it. I like it. Let's go. So I think consumer acceptance, again, with that growth from Plant-Based Foods Association of 2021 of our sector doing 3 times better than regular food in general, I see, and the sustainability demands of the planet, I see the consumer acceptance growing and more plant-based products, and I'm using that loosely to say fermented proteins and alternative meat, cultivated meat, coming down the pike. But what's interesting to me is that one can be a starry-eyed entrepreneur, raising money, working on a product, nailing down every final detail of that product: taste, texture, smell, cookability, long shelf life, how does it last in the fridge? And then saying, oh, but I don't know how to manufacture it at scale. That to me is almost like a Saturday Night Live skit. Like, well, that's such a big part of to actually have impact on the planet. You and I have had this conversation sort of behind the scenes. If you can't scale, what's the point? So it seems like a big oversight to get this far in the equation of making something and throwing one's life, as an entrepreneurs do, into the mix, and then being like, I'm not really sure how to make it at scale. So that to me is very interesting and exciting, I guess, for you as you see this world of opportunity. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way of put it. Elizabeth, as you were talking through, so one of the things I like to look at is when you think about where plant-based food sort of started, or the plant-based foods we see today. You saw years ago some of the call quote unquote veggie burgers, right? So you would have some of the original veggie burgers, and I think as a meat eater, there was no mistaking that was not meat. That
Right,
that
yeah.
did not taste like meat. There was nowhere close to that. But I think you had a generation of vegetarians who normalized to that, who appreciated that. But I'd say by and large, you probably weren't seeing meat eaters saying, hey, I'm going to give up my steak or burger and go to this other product. But then you saw a change. You saw some of the major players we see today come out with burgers and other products that are pretty close to meat from a meat eater standpoint. You've got the mouthfeel, you've got the texture, you've got the way it cooks, you've got the way it looks, you've got all these different things. It's sort of interesting to me. So first time I had an opportunity to work on, but also try one of these early stage products that was being developed. My wife's a vegetarian, and I was telling her about this. And so I am typically vegetarian. I eat meat on occasion. I was telling her about this product that I tried, and I said, you won't believe it. I bit into this, and you could have told me it was a burger, like you put it on the bun, you dress it up, and this tasted like a burger. And she said to me, this was an insightful moment to me. She said, why would I want to eat anything that tastes like a burger? I said, this product is not made for you, right? You're happy with your existing veggie burgers. I mean, I said, this is a product where a traditional meat eater can switch to something different, but still get all the things they're expecting from biting into that burger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very exciting moment, I think, with anyone who's had lived your experience where they're like, sort of a little bit of a doubting Thomas. We'll see what this is all about. I've tried a bean burger, wasn't for me. And then they bite into, Possible Beyond, and there are many others, Uncut. I've had Moving Mountains, I think it's called in Europe. It was outstanding. Field Roast does some great stuff. And you bite into it's like life affirming. You just see the wheels turn in your head like, oh my gosh, so many problems are solved. From a planetary point of view, from an animal welfare point of view, from even a human health point of view. And I do want to take this opportunity in this manufacturing interview to talk about health aspects just for a second, because we're bringing it up. So a lot of LinkedIn conversation about but is a plant-based burger healthy? First of all, no one grabs a burger because they're looking for health, but you don't latch onto a meat burger and say I'm here for the health, but okay, if you do want to have that healthy conversation, a plant-based burger is not going to have cholesterol. It's not going to induce trimethylene oxide. It's not going to have antibiotics. It's not going to have hormones. It's not going to have animal heme, and it is going to have some fiber. Meat has no fiber. So is it a carrot? No, it is not a carrot. That's probably obvious when you picked up the box and scanned the barcode. It is not a carrot. It is not a head of lettuce, but it is healthier. It is a step in the right direction. And then, of course, there's the planet and animals. So but I was sorry. Thanks for letting me digress. I wanted to come back to, I had said, I'd start with the consumer acceptance and I'd end where I think the answer is, you tell me. We don't have enough manufacturing. There is more demand for manufacturing than there is supply with co-mans, and also it takes time to build a plant. So those startups that do have money, they're 2 years out for having the capacity that they'd really like to have. So there's more demand than there is supply in the production of these foods. Is the answer to this just more money, raising more capital early on for the startup? What do you think?
So that's a good question. I think at some point you can practically have, call it all the money in the world. And there are still some technological scaling issues, or there's still some process scaling issues, right? So you can throw more money at it, you can get more engineers, you can buy more capacity, you can build more capacity. There's still a time aspect to it. One of the things I actually talk about, it's a little more mundane on the build side, but I used to see a lot of interest in companies wanting to see incentives, or I call it incentive shopping among different states or jurisdictions. What are you going to give me from a tax standpoint? What are you going to give here? Starting to see that shift and be less of a focus on the financial incentive side, and look more on what can you do on helping me clear regulatory roadblocks? What can you do from a zoning and permitting standpoint? What do you do in terms of having the right municipal infrastructure in place to support this, support the scale up? Because again, these are all things that you don't really think about in production, right? But if we're talking about scaling to a volume and to a model that you're replacing products or a significant portion of products in the grocery store, you're going to need all these things supporting them. You're going to need that infrastructure piece. You're going to need workers, you're going to need engineers, you're going to need constructors. You've got all these pieces. So it's a very complicated, I don't think anyone would complain about more money, right, to throw at the problem. But I think you get to a certain point where it's, you almost have the diminishing returns, right? It's like more money is not going to solve the problem. And you may even then have demands from investors of, now that I've put all this more money on here, have I cut the time in half, right? And again, there are certain things on the back end where you're just not, you're probably not cutting the time in half by doubling the investment, right?
Would that be an argument for a co-man?
Potentially, but I think the co-manufacturer is going to see the same issues. Again, I think, if you look at a flexible co-manufacturer who can produce a lot of these different types of products, they're great for scaling up because they can help a company establish their process, get sort of that pilot plant development in place, develop the product, develop the process. But then you've got the issue of really, how do you do this at scale? And how do you have that, again, depending on what I think your projected demand is and what you're trying to manufacture, I think there reaches a limit from a co-manufacturer, in addition to the ideas of particularly products that have a lot more intellectual property in the development of how do you make sure, if you've now turned over your ingredients and process and everything to a co-manufacturer, again, I think, I'd say the majority are operating certainly from a very tight, trade secret standpoint, but there's, now the process. And again, I look at, this lawsuit from a year ago or so, there's that, now you've got that know-how, you've got a lot of people who now know it, who are outside your company. What does that really mean from a protection standpoint?
Definitely a risk for the company. So much to unpack there. It was fortuitous in timing that the BBC called me for commentary, asking basically what I'm asking you, which is, if there's all this growth in plant-based demand, why don't we just have more plant-based products? And I tried to talk them through everything that we're talking about. But I think the main takeaway is there's no simple fix, because it is indeed a long process. So you can't go from 0 to 100. You have to scale bit by bit. And every time you scale more, take on 20% more capacity and grow your team, the labor, as well as, tweak those machines or get new ones. There's that growing pain to the next step. You can't skip the steps. No matter what the consumer demand is, you can't really skip them. So it is a long process with a long vision, which is why I like you say that when you say that community piece, and that companies are already, even maybe these startups are starting to think about the regulatory hurdles and being a part of the community. I think of Light Life, which is funded by Maple Leaf out of Canada, a meat company, but they're headquartered in Chicago under a Green Leaf umbrella. Light Life and Field Roast, they were building a new plant for Light Life Tempe in Indiana. And to get those tax benefits, they agreed to only hire people from Indiana. Now, mostly Indiana is going to be, either growing crops for animal feed or actually animals themselves to be slaughtered. So, nothing speaks to a community more than the 460 jobs that were going to come to their surroundings. So I think no better way to get people on board than to give them a weekly paycheck. So I think that community piece is a big part of it. But just to share a little fun story. If anybody's ever had Dandy marshmallows, those are the only vegan marshmallows on the planet. And the founders, Dan and Ryan, both engineers, so they have that very lucky skill set in their pocket. And when their kids who were born vegan, weren't having marshmallows at camp, they said, that's it. We can't take it. We're going to make our kids vegan marshmallows. And they built all of their own machinery from scratch. And they've been able to scale up in Chicago through their various growth stages. And they continue to have a lot of growth. And, having those two engineers who built their own stuff and continue to tweak it is really very, very handy. It's like having a mechanic in your household. It's just wonderful. Okay, enough of my side stories. Where do you see us going? So you're in a very unique position in the marketplace, working with folks as they scale. You see their bumps, their hurdles, how they stumble. You see those that have done it well and successfully. And you see all the types of plants that are being built. So maybe we're seeing more fermented proteins and cultivated meat than you are seeing plant-based products. So give us, from where you sit, the vision of the industry now and today, and where are we going?
Good question. A very long question to
Broad
answer.
one.
And, certainly this is from, my lens. I think, there's a lot of discussion in the industry, right? Of, what does this look like? When do you reach that price parity? And, in terms of new food products, when do you reach that regulatory piece and consumer acceptance? But I wanted to back up a moment to one of the things you said, is you used an example of a traditional meat company investing in a new product, right? So I think when I think about high level, these are the types of partnerships that, to me, I believe are really going to change food manufacturing and change the food system. you can certainly be idealistic and say, I don't want to partner with a meat company. I don't want to work with this. I don't want to do that. And, I'm not making a call one way or the other, right? But I think looking from a scaling standpoint, looking from a manufacturing infrastructure standpoint, looking from a distribution standpoint, things like that, I think from my view, the way to really accelerate these things are those partnerships, are those opportunities to how do we work together on this? And it's not just investment dollars. It's the food tech, it's the know-how, it's the distribution channel, it's the manufacturing assets. To be able to, I look at it as a traditional startup is bringing all this really deep research and development, deep food tech, deep food science into the equation, but sort of on the back end, there's that question of manufacturing infrastructure and how do you manufacture it? When you look at, again, I don't want to overgeneralize or oversimplify, but you look at your traditional food manufacturing, it's very focused on the manufacturing side, on the manufacturing infrastructure. Is there R&D and development? Absolutely. And I don't want to, in any way put down the research and development and the food science that's being done there. But I think the deeper innovation is coming out of these startups. And I think we're starting to see recognition from traditional food companies looking whether they have an accelerator, whether they have an investment arm that's making venture investments into some of these companies, whether they're actually buying them outright or acquiring or whatnot. So I think there's some realization. I think there's some understanding that you've really got to merge these pieces together. But again, when we look at that scale up piece, you look at a traditional food product. I mean, modifying a traditional food product even a little bit, there's a lot of research and development and innovation that goes into it. It's not something that happens and changes overnight. So to think that we're going to take for lack of a better term, a practically brand new product, like some of these new plant-based products we're seeing to come on the market, to think that we're going to go from 0 to 60 or 0 to 100 of here's what we've developed at small scale to manufacturing it at the same scale as traditional food companies are doing today, I think there's got to be that partnership piece. Again, whether it's a traditional partnering, whether it's do you create an ingredient or are you taking something, have an offtake with an existing manufacturer? A lot of things to consider, but I look at it from the partnership angle.
Mm-hmm. So much to unpack there. Just to help people understand how scaling changes as you scale, or the product changes potentially as you scale, or the scaling needs change as you scale. From a very simple standpoint, I'll say it was explained to me by the founder of It's Jerky, y'all. He said when he made his jerky in the kitchen and then he went to scale it, how much salt he used changed dramatically. So when he went first time to make a batch product, a scaled jerky, and he used the same amount of salt, just, upping the quantity for the volume, it was a disaster. So he said, then that's just to help people understand, like you can't take a recipe and scale it, and you can't take the plant or the machinery either. Just a little side note. But so what you're talking about, this partnering with strategics, I'll call them, in the meat industry, I'm seeing more and more of that. It's starting very subtly, I'll say, through, it's not really us, it's our venture arm. But more and more, I'm seeing relationships like the one between Jensen Meats and Before the Butcher. Jensen is a meat company. They've purchased Before the Butcher, and now Before the Butcher, which produces the line of uncut burgers, has access to their cold chain trucking and all of their distribution and all of their grocery store relationships, et cetera. And the trade-off is they get that vision and then that deep R&D, like you say, but also that vision that sometimes gets lost in a big company that has been homogenous in their way of thinking for a while. So there's that wonderful trade-off. Everybody always talks about the trade-off of the distribution channels. I'm with you. But what I really want is the advertising budget. So those companies bring huge dollars to advertising that small ones can't. And that's when you really see consumer adoption. And you see that cultural shift. Think of, David, you and I might be from the generation, well, I speak for myself, I'm from the generation, maybe you are, but probably not, where there used to be lots of meat commercials about just how manly it was to eat meat. I haven't seen one of those in a very long time. And as more advertising dollars go towards our sector, plant-based sector, I think you're going to see just how manly it is to eat plants. And that's going to be an ad campaign that comes through. So we've talked about price parity. I would be remiss if I didn't hit that again. When do you think we'll have price parity?
So that's a great question. It's also a dangerous question because no matter what I say, I'm going to
You'll
make,
be wrong.
I'm guaranteed to, I can guarantee you two things. I'm going to be wrong and I'm going to make someone mad, right? No matter what I say. But when I think broader, so if I can maybe broaden that question to price parity, we see different products coming out, right? So we had the initial, old, I'll call it old school for lack of a better word, of the existing plant-based, burgers that were out years ago, right? So that was sort of the start. Then you started to see this next phase of, I think the big players you really see are like the Impossible and the Beyonds when they came out with their I'll call it next stage for lack of a better word, right? So you saw a distinct difference between those products and what was created, 10, 15, 20 years ago. So we've got that. And then I'd actually thought plant-based had sort of matured and I was curious what's going to come next. And then after Future Food Tech in San Francisco, I was really blown away by the different food products we're now seeing well beyond the typical extruded product. Whether it was a plant-based fish product, whether it was a honey product, whether it was a quote unquote meat product or whatnot, or ingredient. Like we've seen all these other truly plant-based products come out. So we've seen those. Some are through a fermentation process, some are through a more traditional food production process. Now we've got this next growth in the fermentation stage, and we're really, from my view and my standpoint, really missing the capacity there to really grow fermentation at scale. You're seeing competition among companies looking for that co-manufacturing capacity and capability. You're seeing co-manufacturers who don't have that capacity. You're seeing that fermentation. That to me, that's sort of the next thing to really grow and really develop. And then I'll take it the step beyond fermentation to the true bioprocess side. We're seeing then it's the question of cultivated meat. So you've got all these different, I think to some, they all fall under the plant-based umbrella or alternative proteins umbrella. But they're really, when you look at them, I think you've got a number of different technologies in there. So I don't think it's a matter of when do you flip the switch and everything goes plant-based, right? So I also think there's an interesting mix and an interesting philosophy in the industry. So I've run into some who believe that we need to eliminate all animal products from our food supply. I run into some who believe that, we need to get rid of none of them and have no plant-based products in the supply, right? What does that really look like? There's going to be a shift. There's going to be a difference. I think what we really need to look at is, as we've talked, when you look at traditional animal agriculture, or should I say mass-produced animal agriculture today, it's really, there's a lot of technology in there. There's a lot of process technology where, growing chickens that produce, twice as much breast meat, right? Or we're figuring out how to grow cows, in the most quote unquote efficient manner possible. But then we've got all these side effects and aspects to deal with, like the antibiotics issue, like potential disease and other issue. And when you think about it and when you look back, I don't know that we were necessarily made to eat meat 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? Maybe not eating meat for every meal. So I think there's still a place for that more traditional meat process, but balancing it with the alternative proteins, with the plant-based space. And really, I think we're going to see again, I don't want to give you a date on price parity because I'm going to be wrong, but I think you're going to start seeing this equalization of a little bit less demand on the animal side, a little bit more demand on the plant side. You're going to see some improved efficiencies. You're going to see opportunities for partnerships between these companies, potentially blended products and processes. And I think you're going to start seeing that level out.
Yeah, I'm really excited about blended products. I think as we move towards cultivated fat, which a cultivated meat piece structurally, a piece of meat, that's very hard, but they're closer. Companies like Mission Barnes on cultivated fat. And when you have cultivated fat as part of the plant-based products, I think you're going to see what you initially tasted maybe a year ago that you thought, wow, this is really close to meat, if not exactly like meat. I think it's going to perhaps even take it better than meat. So now you're talking about health benefits and really that tastes like no other. So I think that's very exciting. I've been working on a study again with VegTech Invest, and we've been looking at meat as a commodity and plant-based as a commodity, particularly in these inflationary times. And now we're all about to shore up for recession. So as we look at what commodities have held their price, I'm doing this from memory, but beans are 13 cents for every 10 grams of protein. Beef is 47 cents for 10 grams of protein. Chicken is 26 cents for 10 grams of protein. And chicken breast, and then chicken tenders are 45 grams for 5 cents for every 10 grams of protein. So Gardein, which has the best scaling capacity probably of any plant-based manufacturer, has chicken tenders at 60 cents for every 10 gram of protein. So very close to price parity, Gardein getting there, and then far and away, and the Hispanic cultures know this, rice and beans, affordable, easy to make, recession proof, if you will. I mean, we all have to eat, so that's buffering us all a little bit. Food is a little bit buffered for recession as it comes our way. But then you look at inflation being quite expensive, or, the cost of meat going up. I think beef, according to the USDA, again, it's from memory, I can get everyone the exact number, is about 13% up this year. Plant-based products about 7% up. So you look at plant-based faring a little bit better in the inflation, and then potentially, if you're just concerned about health and protein, and boy, wouldn't we all lose weight and be healthier if we went to rice and beans, you're looking at very recession-proof. So just some interesting stats as we talk about price parity, since I'm working on that study right now for commodities. But so interesting that you see blended products coming to the forefront, just like I do. And I think that's very exciting. And I'll just agree with you in that you say, there's maybe a place for everything. I think as there is a little bit less demand for meat, potentially, I mean, still growing in India, is growing in China, but more demand for plant-based, and we do see that coming. The economic shift, meat gets the price that it gets because of the volume and the subsidies. And when that volume goes down, we'll see what that does to the bottom line. And then I think it's a business decision for those strategic partners currently making meat. Where are you going to make more money? And when I look at the numbers, again, we study it for VegTech, we think you're going to make more money with plants. So, we'll see how it goes. That said, as we wrap up our interview today, I'm wondering, because you do have this very unique position in the industry, what do you wish you knew 10 years ago that you know now?
That is a good, thought-provoking question. So, I mean, gosh, in general, I'd like to see I would have loved to see the directional shift from a food system standpoint sooner. Maybe it's a matter of just sort of things catching up or things accelerating, but I think we see it now. I think we're seeing a lot of companies, take action on these items. Certainly I think from a broader standpoint, I wish there was a bigger, probably for me, just understanding of what goes into the food supply and so I recently gave a breakfast talk to a Georgia Tech alumni group here in Atlanta. And we were talking about, what do you really know about what goes into what's in your plate? So I don't think typically you go into the grocery store and you've got you can practically get anything you want there, right? You've got, for example, strawberries are available year round. Well, they don't grow in all the places year round, right? So I would say from, now I just have a much better understanding of where personally my food and my family's food is coming from, what's behind that. And, certainly I'm still making decisions on a daily basis, and maybe people disagree with what I do or, what I eat or things like that. But I feel that I know where these things are coming from. I understand what's involved. I understand that, these strawberries that my kids love that I'm buying today are, out of season here and are probably, shipped halfway across the world, right? So I feel like I'm getting a better understanding there. I have a better understanding of what goes into the food supply in general, what goes into meat supply, what goes into the process. And that's really been my biggest takeaway, and where I really encourage people to learn and understand. And again, no value judgments. I don't think it's beneficial to say, you must get rid of animal products, you must do this, you must do that. I think if people just understand what they're consuming, what they're eating, what they're buying, what that impact is on the planet from the simple standpoint of packaging, but go further back into the supply. And for example, that meat product that you're eating, what impact is that really having from a sustainability standpoint on the planet? Again, not making a value judgment, not saying you have to totally get rid of these, but just understanding the impact that your choices have. So I think I'd sum it up and say that's really the one thing that I wish I'd known sooner, was really the impact of the individual things that I eat, where they're coming from, and what does that really mean beyond going to the grocery store and buying a pack of strawberries or meat or whatever it is.
I'll say that I think that's the mojo of the new and improved consumer. COVID led people down a path to want to take control of their health, understand their food supply, and it's been a little bit slow, but I think we're seeing the industry respond. I think soon we'll see a carbon footprint tax, or what's referred to as a carbon tax. I think that's coming. So people understand not just the nutritional aspects, but the impact of their purchase on the planet. I think more and more people are reading ingredient lists. I think more and more people are looking into their own health, what makes their immune system strong, et cetera. And when you have that empowered consumer in voting with some knowledge, I think you also see the food system shift according to those new demands. So I think we're on a path there, at least I hope so, because it's been hard to get transparency in the food supply system to date. And I do think that's a change that we're going to see forthcoming, and that soon you might even be able to walk down the aisle in the grocery store or just put on your Oculus and virtually shop in the grocery store. But you'll be able to pass a product and immediately see like where it came from. This is grown by folks in India, put on a flight. And, I think you'll get to see that, and you can make that decision for yourself. Do I want to be a part, particularly like seafood? Gosh, if we all knew what went into seafood before we purchased it, and then that la land understanding of like, oh, seafood's so great for the environment and ourselves. And if people only knew what went into capturing wild seafood, and the human trafficking involved mostly is what I'm talking about. So, a lot to learn about our food supply system and the sources of the products. Now, again, wrapping up, I got two really quick questions for you on the way out. If you can, keep it to one word answer or one sentence answer. You're having a bad day. Things are not going your way. What do you say to yourself to get yourself back in the groove?
That's a great question. Let's see. I just know I need to make the best decision. I need to, take some action. I'd rather take some action rather than no action. So to me, it's that, I guess I'd say it's the commitment to action. Let me take a step. Let me do something to make a change. Might not be the right one, but let me make a change. Let me take some action.
I love that. I always say to myself, a body in motion stays in motion. So it doesn't matter if you're making big steps or small steps, just keep moving every day. And I'll quote Catherine, Goudot. I'm saying it wrong. I'm sorry, everyone. But she has a great quote. Don't do nothing just because you can't do everything. At least do something. And I like that. That resonates with me. Okay. It's very, very busy day. You don't have time for lunch. What is your go-to snack?
So I love taking a piece of seaweed, a sheet of seaweed, putting a little avocado on it, and sprinkling some everything bagel seasoning on it. And that's like my wife thinks I'm crazy, but that's I enjoy that.
I'm gonna try that. That is everything bagel, avocado, and seaweed. I'm gonna try. That's kind of like avocado sushi roll without the rice. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I'm gonna try it. That is wonderful. I want to thank everybody on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Thanks for being with us live. Thanks for throwing your questions. Tom and Sal, you're always out there with so much commentary. We really appreciate it. But mostly, I want to thank David Ziskind, the engineer in charge of new next gen ag at Black and Veatch. I want to thank you for all your expertise here. We don't get to do a deep dive usually behind the curtain, and you have really pulled back the curtain for us today. So I'm so grateful for that. Of course, everybody can find him, David Ziskind, Ziskind on LinkedIn. Come find him. Come find me. We're always happy to have this conversation. I want you back in like 10 months because I think the industry is going to change that quickly. We'll be able to compare this conversation and we'll see some major steps, hopefully, in the right direction. So I hope you'll come back.
See, that's why I didn't commit to a date on when we reach price parity, because I knew you'd bring back this and say, well, you said 10 months ago, you said this.
Okay, well, you're in the clear. Lucky you. So now you can come back. I really appreciate it. David, stay put. Don't go anywhere. Everybody else, I will see you next Tuesday from New York, live from Future Food Tech and the New York Stock Exchange. See everybody next week.